IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to another episode of All Things Policy. My name is Arjun, and I have with me a special guest today. His name is Siddharth Bannerjee, and he works as a senior policy advisor in the UK Civil Service in the Department for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport. He's also the author of the book Startup City, which is basically about Bangalore's digital and tech startup story. Siddharth and I have been recently working on a document related to quantum tech and what is a sound quantum tech policy for India. So, based off on that document, which is going to be out sometime next week, we wanted to have a conversation about the importance of quantum technologies in the future, at least in the coming decade, and what other countries have done with regard to quantum tech itself. Hi, Siddharth. Welcome to All Things Policy.
Good morning, Arjun. Thank you so much for having me on. Really happy to be on here talking about something that I really have done over the past 3 to 4 years and really have gotten to love because it's one of the most exciting up and coming technologies, emerging technologies in the world. So thanks.
Yeah, no issue. So I guess we kind of delve deep into much about quantum technologies and what it has to offer and the applications of it and what other countries are doing right now. So I thought it would be a good opportunity for us to have a conversation so that even the listeners can understand the intricacies and the nuances behind
Sure.
quantum. Yeah. So one thing, let's start off with something that everyone actually kind of feels that it is necessary for them to know. So, what kind of is the basic definition of quantum tech? Especially, we know that it is a type of technology based off on the applications of quantum physics. But can you just elaborate more on how the principles of quantum physics can actually be used to build different applications using quantum information science?
Sure. So, what I'm not going to do is try and explain the intricacies of how quantum mechanics works, mainly because I'm not a physicist. And somebody I spoke to in a university professor for over 30 years, Sir Peter Knight in the UK, said if anybody tells you that they know what quantum mechanics is or quantum physics is, they're lying because it's still not fully understood. And I certainly don't have a PhD or decades of learning. There's several great videos and tutorials out there that your listeners can learn from. And honestly, they provide a visual images and so on as well. And they will do a much better job than I could ever do. So I would strongly advise your listeners to, if you want to understand that part of it, the physics part of it and the mechanics part of it, please search just YouTube or Google or whatever it is, and you'll find something. What I can talk about more is how we've been harnessing the properties of quantum mechanics in sort of the past 2, 3 decades. And that's made possible the development of sort of new applications, products, services, and so on, which the theory or the science of it has been around for sort of 70, 80 years from the time of Einstein and so on, that they had theorized about this. But it's only in the past 2 to 3 decades that we've moved from the pure science part to where it's becoming an engineering issue. So, sort of commercializing and harnessing these things for commercial purposes. So, the real world applications that we have now are based obviously on those quantum mechanic principles like entanglement and superposition and so on, which I encourage again your listeners to please read up or watch tutorials on. So that has become commercially viable just in the last few decades. And those scientific breakthroughs that we've seen in the last sort of, I would say again, 20 to 30 years, that has been coupled with massive private and public investment. So corporations from Google and Microsoft, IBM, to governments like US, China, and even India have made these investments. And they've developed technologies, and that is showing extremely promising results now. So that's kind of where we are with that. Maybe I think it'll be helpful if I talk about the three sort of broad areas of application I think that would be helpful now.
Yeah, definitely.
So the three are sensing and metrology, quantum communications, and quantum computing, which is the third of which is the largest kind of area of focus and expenditure. So let me quickly just go through those three, and I'll explain also what the like sort of real world applications of each of them. So in terms of sensing and metrology, essentially this field uses specialized sensors which are ultra sensitive and so can be used for precise and super accurate measurements. So things like gravitational sensing in mining and civil engineering. So you can basically look underneath the earth without having to dig, 6 feet. So if you're laying a pipe, for example, or say you're laying a fiber optic cable, you don't have to dig up a huge amount of land just to check if there are rocks or other impediments. You can just scan using these sensors. They're also useful in something called acceleration sensing, which are used in navigation. So what we use as GPS now, these are sort of GPS resistant, hacking resistant GPS. Um, and if I can just say one thing that I actually helped secure funding for, which is part of the United Kingdom's National Quantum Technologies Program, it has a SPLICE project, SPLICE. And these are cameras that can detect, with quantum sensors, obviously, that can detect leakage of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So there's so many different applications for those sensors. Another one that I worked on, that a company which I won't name now, but they are used to be British and were bought over by Indian companies. So I'll let your listeners figure out which company was that. Are using these to see possibly things around corners. So what lidar that we have now in driverless cars and so on, that I think people have heard of in Tesla, and that this can see around a corner. Obviously, you can't see exactly what the object is or the color of, the object. Say it's a person, but what you can tell is whether it's a tree or a person or a dog or a child or whatever it is. So it's that sort of thing which you kind of only see in these Marvel movies when they say quantum this, quantum that. There is some basis in reality. So that's the sensing one. Shall we move to quantum comms now?
Yeah, I mean, quantum comms is something which has evolved gradually and is gaining a lot of traction right now, right? So, quantum
Mhm.
comms is especially with whole the random number generators and creating encrypted and unhackable systems and stuff like that. So, yeah, I'll let you get into quantum comms itself. Yeah.
Absolutely, Arjun. You've mentioned the two most important parts of this, which are quantum random number generators and quantum key distribution, which is essentially unhackable given this entanglement property that the subatomic particles have. So basically, if one part of that particle is somehow disturbed, the other half of the particle will get a signal, and no matter what distance that they are connected at, they will be paired, and therefore you can know that one part has been tampered with, and therefore it's been hacked. So this is something that is, a recent application of it, and countries like China, for example, are using satellites to do communications using this. People are using fiber optic cables as well. So the distance is still a little bit of an issue, as is something called background noise and signal strength. So they have boosters and so on, but the engineering part, like I said earlier, is still being needs to be worked out. Why don't we move quickly to the last one, which is the quantum computing, which is kind of the biggest area of expenditure and investment by both companies and governments. So mainly, this is going to be the most commercially lucrative application of quantum technology, in my opinion. And it uses something called quantum bits to use in our regular, laptops and computers and so on, which are bits and bytes. These are quantum bits or qubits. And the difference is they can handle not just binary, so not just 0 or 1, but they can handle any value between 0 and 1 at any given point of time. So that means it has multiple states, which means the computing power increases exponentially rather than just linear. right? So we're reaching the point with what are called classical computers, or just normal computers that we use now, where you can't fit more transistors on a chip, or the Moore's law is coming to kind of the end, where every 18 months you can't get faster and faster computers. So this is something that overcomes that problem. The uses of these are in optimization, search, and solving problems at an extremely fast pace because of the other property, which is superposition. So you can have multiple different subatomic particles working together, and instead of linear, like I said, they superimpose in a exponential rate. So by the time you've reached something like, say, 50 qubits or 100 qubits, definitely 100 qubits, you're going faster than the fastest supercomputer there is right now. And these computing systems are going to dwarf any supercomputers. But again, the issue is the engineering required to implement this in real life situations is still an issue. So both governments and large corporations using everything from sort of superconductors, which are zero resistance conductors. So basically things are cooled down to sort of minus 235 or so Kelvin, to try and make those subatomic particles interact in this manner. So Google and IBM are using that. But the problem is you can only maintain these quantum states for super, super short periods of time. Uh, and at that very almost absolute zero temperature, it's very hard to do, as you can imagine. Then there's another one called trapped ion systems, where the ions, which are the electrically charged particles, are cooled and trapped, quote unquote, with the help of lasers. So I saw this at Oxford University, actually, that's pioneering on this. And it's really amazing the types of things that you can do with this. Obviously, the advantage is you don't need these like massive fridges that super cool items to minus, almost negative zero. Sorry, absolute zero, not negative zero. I beg your pardon. And there's some photonic quantum devices or silicon spin quantum devices. Again, let me just leave this for your listeners to do a bit of research, because me explaining it just is not going to show you the kind of wide variety and the kind of absolutely amazing technology there is.
Yeah. I
Just
mean,
yeah.
yeah, go ahead, go ahead.
No. I'm just saying, it's there's so many different types of things that are happening now, different types of methods to get to this, that it's really exciting, and that's all I was saying.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, when I started first researching on quantum itself for our project, the vast area of technology it is, and the multiple kind of applications it has,
Mhm.
kind of surprised me as well. And it's heartening to know that these applications kind of be the next big thing. So I know that you worked with the UK government on formulating policies to improve the country's quantum ecosystem itself. So, I just want to understand how countries around the world have approached quantum science and technology from like a potentially economic and strategic lens, because as you mentioned, right, there are quantum comms which are dealing with unhackable systems, which is clearly a military application right now, or even
Mhm.
say a quantum computing which has huge amounts of computing power and can crack codes so easily and can break down any sort of encrypted systems. So these kind of applications are hugely like strategic. It can be viewed from a strategic lens, and of course, economically, it will reap a lot of benefits as well. So, how are countries, especially in the West, have approached this quantum tech?
Sure. No, that's a super interesting question, because yeah, countries are absolutely approaching this from a very strategic angle. So, in terms of the strategic aims and objectives, Arjun, there are two main reasons: economic and security related. So, getting to the first one, there's literally hundreds of billions of dollars or pounds or whatever you want in value creation that has been forecast for quantum tech, especially quantum computing. So, governments are becoming more and more aware of this sort of economic imperative to nurture this emerging tech. for businesses, industry, and broader commercial and social spillover effects as well. So, just in terms of some numbers, the current size in sort of, the 2021 22 is around 10 billion or so. But the rate of growth is predicted at something like almost 30% year on year. And so in 5 years, we're talking, sort of 35 billion. And most of this will be in computing, something like, I would say 50 to 60% would be in computing. Communications will be about 10 billion of that 35 billion, and the rest will be about in sensing. And the applications run from everything from energy exploration to aerospace to transport and logistics. Another huge one is chemicals, so like pharmaceutical industry, healthcare, so for example enhancing diagnostics, and obviously security, which is cryptographic systems that we spoke about briefly, secure communications, navigation systems, and so on. So that's one side of it in the economic side. And then I mentioned a little bit about the security side, which is that quantum computer that's not even super advanced, that's quite basic, say 50 to 70 to 100 qubits, can literally break any existing public encryption key. So governments are in a kind of mad dash to secure their own data and information. But at the same time, they also want to be in an offensive position to gain the technology to get advantage over their rivals, right? So it's both offensive and defensive. Um, the issue here is, unlike sort of AI, blockchain, and so on, quantum requires a huge amount of initial investment. So physical infrastructure and human capital, because this is not an easy front end heavy technology that requires scientists and advanced researchers and large hardware devices to build these quantum capabilities. So what we see is only around 25 countries around the world, 25 to 30, but in total, that's with any all of them put together, it's only about 25 countries that have any sort of ongoing quantum technology programs. And there's a massive amount of variance between the bottom and the top in terms of investment, programs, technology readiness levels, all those sorts of things. So, for these reasons that I've outlined, the difficulty of initial setup, governments generally focus on sort of a twofold strategy. So that's bringing together the academic and industry players to kind of spur on the R&D, and also creating an ecosystem where the outputs of this R&D be commercialized and used for general purpose applications, right?
Yeah, I mean, as you mentioned, right? So, a couple of countries have already invested a huge amount of money in developing quantum technology, such as I guess the national mission of the US and even the UK. We'll get into India's later, but I guess countries are looking at it more from return on investment perspective rather than just saying, "Oh, okay, it's a lot of initial investment, so we're not going to get into the field itself." So, at least as far as I've seen from what research I've done,
Mhm.
a bunch of countries, even the ones with a smaller economic growth or a smaller GDP per capita, have kind of invested in quantum technology as a future, as or at least to harness it in the future. So that seems heartening to see.
Yeah, absolutely. And the way that they're doing this is generally setting up like collaboration hubs or centers of excellence to get the science right. Then they do things like challenge prizes, which solve specific use cases or targeted use cases via a consortia. So they bring together startups, academics, big corporates, government, etc., and then say, see if you can solve this really intractable problem, like sequencing every single human genome, or finding how cancer cells mutate or something like that. So like a specific targeted problem. Third thing they do is they do dedicated funding for projects that are of national importance, so security stuff, for example. And the last one is they try and build an ecosystem where investment is provided for product or service innovation through startups or scale ups, and accelerator programs or deep tech incubator programs. So Yeah, I mean, China is definitely emphasizing specific bits. You mentioned China, so they're well ahead of the rest of the world, I would say, in quantum comms. But for example, the UK's national mission is to build a fault-tolerant quantum computer in the next 5 to 10 years. So that's kind of the difference. Let's chat a bit more about that.
Yeah, definitely. So let's kind of get into quantum computing itself. As you mentioned, right, quantum computing remains the biggest area of growth and economic returns in the quantum field. So we know that the
That's
private
right.
sector, yeah, the private sector has got into this field a lot, especially Google, IBM, Microsoft, each of them having their own dedicated quantum research team. But interestingly, that Google did not actually have a research team, and they just got a professor from I think from UCLA, and he started Google's research team, and now Google has third best or the third fastest quantum computer in the world. So
Yeah.
it's nice to see that the private sector has kind of you know has viewing quantum computing as a very good field to get into, or as a field which will become very important in the future. So how do you view like the global quantum computing landscape, because there is both the government and the private sector who are involved in this field?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the thing to remember here again is that only a handful of countries and corporations can even dream of possessing something that has any capability or is of any level of significance to have a meaningful impact, right? Like I said, the setup costs are so vast and the amount of expertise you need, et cetera, et cetera. That's the first thing to remember. So, in terms of spending and impact, at the top definitely are US and China. And in some way, they are locked in I don't know what race, Cold War race, or what to call it, but it's a race basically to get quantum superiority over the other. So, the National Quantum Initiative Act that you mentioned earlier, they've spent about 1.5 billion or so on 5 research centers that specialize in quantum information systems. But what the US has as well is, like you mentioned, Microsoft, Google, IBM are all working with the government in this. A couple other companies, not necessarily within the US, are Honeywell, Fujitsu, D-Wave, etc. And there's also rumors of Amazon getting involved, but these are very highly secretive plans that I've just heard speculation about actually, and I have not really seen or heard anything publicly or officially about it. They've all spent hundreds of millions of dollars to conduct both the scientific research, but obviously, as companies and corporates, they want to commercialize this quantum tech as well. China, on its end, listed quantum specifically in its 13th five-year plan. So that was, I think, 2016 to 2020, 2021. And they've poured in 10 billion to build a national lab for quantum information science. On their side as well, they have Alibaba, Tencent, Baidu, and they have also invested heavily in quantum labs, institutes, research centers, etc. So they're also working, given the model that China adopts, they're working much more closely with the government. And I think you have I think a recent podcast on the Takshashila site, which talks about this. So I would encourage listeners to check that out as well. Quickly, there's countries in the EU and UK that have been funding quantum initiatives for a couple decades now, and they're ramping up spending massively. Germany and France are leading, and UK has just published a national strategy. So everybody's going kind of big on this. So I would say US, China top tier, Germany, France, EU, etc. UK are second tier, and then kind of third tier ish are India, Netherlands, South Korea, Russia, Canada, etc., who are spending more and more on this. And they're getting, business partners, industry partners involved. And then there's kind of the small, very small countries. I mean, not very small countries. They happen to be small countries, but they're spending a small amounts comparatively, obviously. So places like Israel, Japan, Singapore are pursuing some programs, but largely in collaboration with other nations. So to defray costs and set up costs, infrastructure costs, and piggyback on existing innovation. So I think
Yeah.
that's kind of an overview of what the landscape looks like.
Yeah, I mean that's really helpful to know that a lot of countries are in the field itself. And interestingly, China now owns two of the fastest computers in the world, with them releasing Shuangxi 2 last year, which has more number of superconducting qubits than Google's quantum computer itself. So it's now this is kind of a definition of how initial investments have paid off, because I guess China just started their quantum project or a quantum ecosystem in the late 2000s, and now they've reached to a level which other countries can kind of dream of. So yeah, before we continue, let's just take a small break and we'll be right back.
Sure.
Hey everybody, it's been another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. On Cyrus Says, Cyrus talks to renowned film critic, author, and journalist Anupama Chopra about her new book, A Place in My Heart. On Shunya One, Shiliditya and myself are joined by co-founder of Blue Tokai, Matt Chandranjan. We discuss the origin story of Blue Tokai. The Simplified host talked to Dr. Nitin Arora about COVID and its impact on the medical fraternity. On Smarter with Sid, Siddharth explores what it means to be inclusive and politically correct in today's day and age. And on Tere Mere Raste, Keshav visits Kushinagar, the sacred place believed to be where the Buddha attained Mahaparinirvana. Also, just one quick announcement for everybody. Would like you to check out the new version of our Android app. It's available on the Play Store. It's a really interesting take on how to listen to podcasts. Do give it a look and let us know what you think. We're open to feedback on all of our social media channels. We're IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Also, do remember, if you're enjoying this show or any of our other shows for that matter, please do tell a friend. Word of mouth really does help. And don't forget to rate us on any of the platforms you're listening to us on. And you can also check us out on YouTube. And we have a number of channels there at ivmpodcast.com/YouTube where you can take a look at them. And finally, we'd like to thank our sponsors this week, Bank of Baroda and CoinSwitch Kuber. Thank you so much for making this possible.
Welcome back to All Things Policy. So we were having a discussion with Siddharth about quantum technologies and how countries around the world are harnessing quantum tech itself. So now let's get into the Indian point of view, or the Indian national interest view. So we when we both researched about India's foray into quantum tech, we saw that the government actually has taken cognizance of quantum as a potential area of strategic technology. The fact that they released the national mission for quantum technology and applications in the budget of 2020, which is the financial year 2020-2021, and with kind of a outlay of around 8,000 crores over 5 years to develop quantum tech in the country itself. So, Siddharth, can you just kind of elucidate a bit more about how India has encouraged development of this quantum technology in the country?
Sure. Thanks, Arjun. So the current situation in India, as you mentioned, there's a big budget, almost 8,000 crore that's been sanctioned, but the overall ecosystem is very underdeveloped and needs, pardon the phrase, but a quantum leap to achieve even sort of basic levels of utility. So, as you mentioned, 2020 is when they've put this money in, which is quite late in the day, given how far other countries have gotten. But they've recognized the importance of this technology, so that's a good first sign. So, what we know about this is quite sparse as well, and the report that you and I did, Arjun, we delved into kind of Lok Sabha questions and so on to try and get an understanding of what is being done and what has been done in terms of the national mission. The primary aims, not surprisingly, were to promote research and development, strengthen international research cooperation, nurture startups, etc. This is all kind of pretty standard operating procedure when setting up a new technology. But prior to this as well, they had done some funding of research programs. So the Quantum Enabled Science and Technology, or Quest, to groom young scientists in the field of quantum. So there was, I think, about 186 crores over 3 years, with 50 to 60 researchers taking part in these experimental theoretical research. So there's some targeted PhD programs and so on. So in terms of what this 8,000 crore that was mentioned in the budget, I think that main aims are to build a 50 qubit quantum process and obviously the algorithms that need to go along with it for simulation. There's also QKD, or the quantum key distribution for quantum comms, with a range of 1,000 kilometers that was mentioned. Something was also there about magnetometers and quantum materials. And then in September 2021, there was something called the Quantum Computer Simulator, or QSIM toolkit, to provide a better development environment to academics, industry professionals, students, and kind of the general scientific community in India. So, like I said, we don't know too much on this, because when the response was made in the Lok Sabha report, etc., the report has not actually been published or released for public consumption. So we are still a little bit in the dark about what's happening, who's talking to whom, how has the money been spent, which key private sector partners are being involved, things like that. It's just we're all a little bit in the dark in terms of how the funds were allocated, dispersed, or utilized, or any of that stuff. So can we really say that if there has been credible advancements at this stage? I would say not really, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, when we were looking into how much progress has been made since the announcement of the national mission itself, we found that the project which was announced has not been even approved yet, as at least per one of the
Hmm.
responses in the Lok Sabha in 2021. So forget about allocating funds from the 8,000 crores outlay, but
Yeah.
it hasn't even gotten forward and hasn't moved forward yet. So all we can hope is that the government, or at least even the private sector, at least the fledgling private sector in India, can kind
Mm.
of push the government into develop quantum as fast as possible, because it's a race, right? And now the fact that everyone are getting into it, just it kind of diminishes the prospects of how much India can actually do. So as we hope that our report would be picked up by someone and kind of use that as a framework for developing India's quantum ecosystem itself. So
Hmm.
yeah, so other than the whole quantum landscape in India, we also kind of envisaged our own recommendations, right? So for
That's right.
how India can improve and build its ecosystem. So would you kind of like to just take us through a bit of that, and where to focus on, what the government should focus on if India wants to become a quantum power, or at least be credible enough to harness the applications of quantum tech? So
Sure.
yeah, so you can just run us through that.
Absolutely. So I think the first step is acknowledging that the government has, put this, given this some level of importance, and they've acknowledged that, it is something of importance that needs to be taken care of and funding. So that's at least a first step that they've taken. But in terms of creating an ecosystem, and building a value chain and so on, just again for listeners, when our report comes out in a couple of weeks, please, we've got a whole thing about the value chain and how that works and so on. So it's quite granular. I won't go into that now, but I think what I can say is that we've got a sort of fourfold path to quantum enlightenment. That's what we're calling it. And these are, the first is establishing research centers within universities. The second is coordinating efforts across both central and state level governments. The third is harnessing the power and promise of corporates and startups. And fourth is facilitating international cooperation. So these are the four main ones. I'll just quickly run through each of them. So, in terms of establishing research centers, I mean, as I've been harping on about in this podcast, is R&D is the key, and the R&D, all of this cutting edge research is done in higher education institutions and university laboratories. So, quantum is no exception in this case. So, priority must be given to these educational institutes, both in terms of funding and government support. So, in terms of removing any barriers to importing scientific equipment, for example, or international research collaborations are prioritized, etc. And if they spend money on this to develop new applications and algorithms and so on, and also at the same time connect academic institutions with industries, so this will lead to the translation of the research into real world applications, so commercialization pipelines and so on. The other thing that it does is provide IP, right? IP, intellectual property development. So once we gain these rights and IP, they can help India gain an upper hand, both economically in terms of sort of licensing fees and strategically through patent rights, for example, across multiple industries. Because as I mentioned at the very top of the program, this is going to be a multi-industry thing. The other advantage that India has is relatively low cost talent pool, just because our cost of living is different and so on. Our scientists give much more value for money compared to, say, a scientist in the EU or United States or wherever. So kind of building up this talent pool is key. There's a super small talent pool right now, literally hundreds of researchers, that's it. Or even if you take all the industry professionals, academics, entrepreneurs, research, everybody together, it's not more than, I would say, maybe a few thousand in India. So building this quantum ecosystem is key, both intellectually and physically. So in terms of jobs and so on. So that's the first one, right? The second one is coordinating efforts across central and state governments. So obviously, this is such a huge undertaking that different levels of government will have to work together and different state administrations will have to work together, especially when it comes to things like fabrication, manufacturing, etc., basic devices. So even semiconductors, with the way it's going with that, with the fabrication factories, etc., this will need to be done by the government, both financially and non-financially. So having a sort of national mission, I think, would be really good for establishing, say, quantum innovation hubs like the UK government has that I worked on. And these can also serve as centers of collaborative innovation between academia and private sector. The sort of last point here is government should also help to establish a conducive fiscal and legal environment. So if international companies want to collaborate, removing any barriers that might be there, obviously keeping in mind safety and so on, but making those investment friendly laws and trade policy to lower import duty, for example, is just an example. So the government can be really helpful in that to help establish and improve India's very, very fledgling quantum industry. The last two is, I think listeners will know this. I don't need to talk too much, but harnessing the power of corporations and startups. So engaging with the private sector is key. I don't need to explain any more about that. But just we already know big companies like IBM, Google, etc., are getting involved in this. So I think the government's role here is to facilitate the collaboration between corporates and startups. Corporates, the added advantage is they have technology integration across multiple geographic markets, so we can leverage that. And startups have the agility and pace that they work at, which is their advantage of being a small company. So bringing these together, with targeted microeconomic support, things like subsidies and tariff cuts, etc. And I think the government had a semiconductor package for production-linked incentives, PLI schemes. They could do a similar thing for quantum. Other things they could do is upfront capital expenditure support, tax deductions, industry loans. There's so many different options here. And again, these will all be detailed in the report, so listeners can gather that from there. Finally, the last one is international cooperation, which is super, super important given the current state of what quantum technology looks like. Because it is such a complicated technology and because we're quite far behind, international collaboration becomes that much more important. So, kind of having those multilateral, bilateral agreements with countries who are advanced in the field is imperative. They need to form alliances with like-minded countries so we can do tech transfer, trade, etc. So, one first step, just as an example, could be engaging with allies in the Quad or BRICS countries or SAARC countries. So, where they had the Quad Semiconductor Supply Chain Initiative, for example, which looked at diversification and collaboration in the semiconductor domain, quantum can also benefit from something like this, so that we can build a kind of broad, equitable, and transparent global tech ecosystem for quantum.
Yeah, I mean, those are our broad recommendations. But yeah, as you mentioned, right? So there are big corporations like Google, IBM, Microsoft are working on this, but there are also Indian startups. There are a bunch of startups, Qno Labs, Boson Q, and others who are doing incredible work in quantum tech. So uh,
Absolutely.
I think the government should take cognizance of the fact that work is happening, and they need to kind of ramp up their support for these fledgling startups and any other
Mhm.
organization who is willing to work with them in developing quantum
Yeah.
tech for civilian or even the national security purposes. Yeah, so this was a very enlightening conversation, Siddharth. I think our listeners will have fun reading the document we put out, and I hope all the listeners do read it. So this was just a glimpse into what the document offers on quantum and quantum tech itself. Thank you so much, Siddharth, for joining me on All Things Policy. We hope to have you soon again.
My pleasure. Thank you so much, Arjun.
Yeah, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
Namaste, this is Cyrus Brocha. I am part of the government cancel culture program to remove rubbish off all the different streams available. So what we have is all the collected rubbish we put together on our show. It's called Cyrus Says. It's on IVM Podcast. You have to watch it and listen to it. It's on our app. It's on our website. It's on the YouTube channel. It's on Facebook. There are many different ways. Don't bother me and ask me how. You have to find out. We talk to different personalities. Many of them are known. Some are just people we meet downstairs and invite them up for chai. But the point is, it's fun and it's very therapeutic. So please join in and listen to Cyrus Says.
Eventually, you'll see the end of your childhood,
Get accustomed to womanhood.
enjoy the experience of sisterhood,
Might get to wifehood
or not, choose motherhood,
or not. You'll learn to define your personhood.
earn a livelihood,
Change the neighborhood.
and get rid of the falsehood that life post-academia is easy.
So join me, Ritasha,
And me, Ayushi,
on a journey from station starting point.
to station, what now?
Next station, Pudin station, and hopefully, Agla station, adulthood.
Fresh episodes out every Thursday.